Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this webinar on the characteristics of high-performing boards for 2021. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? Okay, thank you. So my name is Elizabeth Ntege. I am a director and co-founder of NFT Consult Group of Companies. I also serve on the board of a number of organizations as a non-executive director and board trustees in Uganda and in the UK. For this afternoon, allow me to you our two main guests. Our first guest and host for this conversation is Jimmy D. MUGERWA, an executive coach and senior business leader in the energy sector. Jimmy is also founder and managing partner of Zoramo Consulting Group, where he leads with passion, creates value, and makes a difference in the success of the companies and their people's lives. Jimmy has a strong background in government relations and commercial skills, with experience in negotiating and managing complex transactions in Africa, most especially challenging joint venture partnerships. Jimmy has over 27 years of senior business leadership with full P&L management in the oil and gas sector across Africa and Europe. He has led teams managing complex projects, building relationships with senior political and government leaders, and tapping into his networks with African opinion leaders. Jimmy spent 8 years as the chair and group African advisor for Uganda at Tullow Oil PLC in the UK, and most notably, managing director for Tullow Oil Uganda. For 4 years, Jimmy chaired the Presidential Investors Roundtable for Oil and Gas, and as the Vice Chair Board of Trustees, Uganda Chambers of Mines and Petroleum. Prior to joining Tullow, he worked for over 19 years for Royal Dutch Shell in various senior management positions that included Senior Regional Advisor for Sub-Saharan Africa, Shell Africa's Retail Marketing Manager, General Manager for Shell Africa, East Africa, Country Chair for Kenya, Shell, and Retail Manager in Ghana. Currently, Jimmy serves on various boards, most notably as the board chair of the DFCU Bank Limited in Uganda, non-executive director at Diageo East African Breweries Limited and Uganda Breweries Limited. Jimmy, you're so welcome. Thank you. So our second, thank you. So our second guest is Patrick Dunne. Patrick has extensive experience of working with boards in Europe, Asia, and North America. He currently chairs the board of consultancy firm Board Delta, the EU Foundation Charity Board, and the Education Sub-Saharan African Charity Board. He's also the chair of the Oversight Board for the Chartered Management Consultancy in the UK, as well as the board trustee of the Chartered Management Institute. Patrick's executive experience includes 26 years in a variety of investment and management roles with 3i Group PLC, where until 2012, he was the communications director, a member of their operating committee, and the chairperson of their operational risk forum. Patrick also has extensive experience of developing social enterprises, most notably with the LEAP Confronting Conflict, where he was the patron and chairperson from 2006 to 2015. Other social enterprises include the Education Sub-Saharan Africa and the E&Y Foundation. Patrick has a passion for education and was the member of the General Council of the University of Warwick from 2006 to 2015. He is the visiting professor at Cranfield School of Management, an associate fellow at Warwick Business School, and a former member of the Business in the Community's Education Leadership Group. In 2006, he founded Warwick, a social enterprise in Africa that has now benefited over 750,000 Ugandan, 750,000 young Africans through transformed math and English teaching. Patrick is the author of the award-winning Boards and 3 other successful books on the subject, and has helped to establish many successful courses on board skills over the last 20 years. Through Bold Delta, he has helped chairpersons across a wide variety of sectors transform the effectiveness of their boards. Patrick, you're so welcome too. So for the rest of the team, before I hand over to Jimmy, we would like you to also submit any questions you want the team to handle through our chat box, and we'll keep an eye on it. Over to you, Jimmy. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I do recognize a lot of names and colleagues. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, which I think is going to be a very exciting day, because we've got a gentleman with a lot of stripes as far as boards are concerned, Patrick DUNNE. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you, Jimmy. Great to be here. And I'm so sorry I couldn't actually be on the ground today, which I would normally be, but this is a great event. Thank you.
Yeah, but thanks for making time, Patrick. Just maybe, I was just thinking about, you know, how the UK has changed. But I can see you have some sunshine today, even though yesterday I saw a lot of snow on the football pitch. But on a lighter note, there are a lot of football fans on here who follow the Premiership. And many of them also follow my team, which unfortunately can give you some pain. You know, I'm an Arsenal fan. And I know you also love football, being somebody from Liverpool and who supports Everton. But as we jump into this topic of boards and how boards have changed and you know, the characteristics of high-performing boards, do you relate with what we've seen in football, whereby you know you see a football game and you have only 2,000 spectators in a stadium like Emirates, which ordinarily would have about 60,000 people, and yet they have succeeded going through this pandemic, and they're coping. And we sit in our sitting rooms without even noticing that there are no fans. What's your own view on that?
Well, on the football, I think you know, there's a loss of soul about the game when you haven't got fans, and I think the big teams particularly would claim, you know, it's like a big burst of energy that you get from the crowd, and it also obviously intimidates the away team as well. So I think something has been missing, and it was interesting watching the Everton v Chelsea game the other day, where there were only 2,000 fans, but boy did they make some noise. And actually it was really interesting in the interviews with the players did seem energized by having the fans back, and actually there was one of them who had a tear in his eye at the beginning of the game. It was quite an emotional thing as well. So it's good to see the start of fans back as we have the vaccines starting to happen here. Hopefully they will bump up through 2021, and we'll get back to you know, traditional crowd sizes. And I think there are parallels to the boardroom in the way that we've been conducting ourselves virtually, and I know we're going to get into that in a minute, but it's yeah, it's been a roller coaster time here.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it does make sense for us to put some structure around the discussion, and probably starting off with that famous triangle of yours, people, process, and purpose. And I do remember that slide when you shared it with
this one?
Yeah, that slide, yeah, that one. Yeah. I think it helps put some structure around the discussion. And I remember this slide when you first showed it to us in the Financial Times Board Directors Diploma Program many years ago. But the thing I took away from this slide, which I still find relevant and useful, is that it gives clarity of purpose as a whole, and you combine it with getting the right people involved, and then having the right governance around the board. And I also remember you once mentioning that to have a board that is fit for purpose, everybody needs to understand their purpose, why they're on the table. What's the purpose of the board? And there are very many people today, if you speak to and you ask them what is the purpose of your board, very many people can't identify and can't answer that question. So I look at it today, and maybe the challenge I would like to give to our listeners and viewers who are on call is, if you step back for a moment, and those of you who are board members, and you ask that question, why are we here as a board? Do you think you'd get the same answer? It would be interesting to see that, and I wonder whether we can have that as a poll.
Okay, I'll stop sharing that.
Ivan, could we have the poll around purpose, please? But maybe as Ivan is putting up that poll, for me, purpose is not a tagline we put in the board charters. It is really our reason to exist and how we create value for the stakeholders. But viewers, if you could have an interactive session and you answer that question. So the question is the purpose of the board agreed and clearly communicated in your organization, or read it as your board? Please vote, and we'll see how many of us are aligned on that.
Yeah, while you're doing that, I thought I might just say, where did that triangle come from? When I was relatively young in private equity, I've literally not been with throughout very long. I inherited a workout portfolio, a portfolio of companies which was not doing very well, but we had minority equity stakes where we didn't have a board seat, but we had observer rights. And I went along to the first one of these, and it was a family company. It was turning over probably $150 million. It was a substantial company, but it was in a mess. It was in difficulty. And the board meeting was long and complex and fractious. And at the end of the board meeting, I sat with the chair and gave some reflections on the meeting, and we started to talk. And it seemed to me that all of the issues that he was engaged in and trying to deal with were to do with purpose, people, or process, because it was unclear why the family owned the company. It was unclear what the strategy and the purpose of the company was. It was unclear what the role of the board was. It was unclear what the role of the executive was. They clearly had, if I could be slightly cruel, they had the wrong people talking about the wrong things. So there were a lot of people issues. And there were as many quality of relationship issues as there were competence issues. So there was a big bunch of stuff around the people. And then the process in terms of the agenda, the management of the meetings, the board papers, the follow-up, the decision-making, all of these things were a problem. And because I have a condition known as dyslexia, I find it difficult to write lots of long notes. So I tend to use mathematical symbols a lot to summarize my thoughts. And I drew this triangle, and I wrote purpose, people, process. And I put momentum in the middle, which we can explain later. And I thought, if you've got a board with clarity of purpose, with unity of purpose, with the right people working together in the right way, and with good process, then you ought to perform reasonably well. And from that point, I started to use that framework in doing due diligence on boards. If we were making an investment, I'd look and see, how are they on these three things? How do they stack up? And then working with existing boards that needed to change, we would do the same. So here we have the poll result.
Here we have the poll results. Interesting. 77% of the people on the call believe that their purpose is clearly communicated in the organization, which is quite a very good number, because and I encourage people to go back and just check with their own boards. But just taking that discussion of yours, and you think about ourselves as board members, you know, we should be asking management some tough questions, the executives. We should be asking management almost a similar questions. How many of your employees as execs understand what the purpose is and are able to kind of relate with it? I think
yeah, I think so. And it's really interesting that, I mean, I don't think you can really talk about the role of the board without talking about the role of the executive at the same time. So, you know, for me, the role of the board is really about having the right vision and strategy, having the right resources, and having the right governance. And the management, you know, their role is really to develop, with input from others, including the board, the business plan, to deliver the business plan, and to maintain financial and operational integrity. And if both the management and the board are very clear what their roles are, then I think they have you know, it's important for them to communicate to others. This is what the board does. This is what the management does. This is what we do together. And for that to be clear. And the very best boards communicate, you know, they do it in different ways. They might say, you know, this is how we're governed, or, you know, this is who does what. This is which decisions go to the board, which go to the exec. And they communicate well after board meetings, saying, you know, our board met last week and this is what we decided to do.
And Patrick, if you put back that slide, and for me, some of the things which I've seen that have been helpful is that I've also found that if people are able to connect to that higher purpose, it becomes a motivator in the organization. So purpose motivates people, and getting this relationship right, you then are able to have a performing organization or a performing board. In your view, Patrick, and from your experience, and we had Elizabeth read your CV, how do you think a good chair would go about to ensure that there's a common understanding as far as purpose is concerned in the boardroom?
So first of all, I think the board and the executive need to agree what that purpose is. So I think what I've seen sometimes go wrong is where you try and communicate a purpose that not everyone is bought into. Not everyone thinks is the same thing or means the same thing, particularly in an international group where words can mean different things in different contexts. So I think one of your duties as a board is to make sure that you have the right purpose. And one of the things that we've seen in the last year with COVID, for example, is that many organizations have reoriented their purpose. And you know, it's been very difficult to do that at the speed which you've needed to do. Others, it's just reinforced that purpose. But it's very important that the board is aligned behind that purpose and the management is, and then that you communicate it really clearly. What's interesting with a lot of purpose statements is that they're a bit fluffy and a bit lacking in substance often. So if you look at websites of people, you know, the purpose might be very grand and very well-meaning, but actually, what does it mean in the context of that company? So the ones that I like are ones where you can actually measure things, so you can see whether that purpose is being fulfilled. So there's an example I use, which is a very small, relatively small company called BizSpace, and what they do is provide office space and factory space to medium-sized small companies. And in their statement, they say, you know, we want to create places for people to feel proud of. We want to celebrate their successes. And you might say, oh, well, that sounds very nice, but what does that mean? What's interesting is they actually measure month by month how proud people are to be in the places that they rent to people. They also spend a certain amount each year promoting the businesses that occupy their premises, because they think that increases loyalty. They think it increases the success of the businesses that occupy their premises, and therefore they'll need more space, and so on. And they measure the innovations that come from their customers, because the other thing that they do is put a great emphasis in their purpose on listening to their customers. So that's a good example of a very practical workmanlike, if you like, purpose rather than a grand statement.
Yeah, and maybe just to add on that, I think the other important thing is also to kind of find what is that unique selling point. So if I showed it to the employees or showed it to the board members, would they be able to differentiate between my company and the other company? So
yeah, exactly.
Is an important one, isn't it?
Yeah, and so for ESSO, which is, you know, Education Sub-Saharan Africa, our purpose is to join up, inform, inspire, and increase impact for people investing in education in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we can measure, you know, are we joining people up? Are we inspiring? Are we changing thinking on a big topic? Are we producing evidence from people to make decisions? And then as a consequence of that, are we increasing, you know, the impact of scholarship spending or whatever it might be? So I think it is possible to make a purpose really tangible and give it proper meaning week to week and be able to measure your progress.
Yeah, and we'll come back and talk about your latest book, by the way, which I'm halfway through. It's quite sizable, but I see you've also covered it along the lines of purpose, process, and people, and then you have dilemmas at the end, which are pretty useful as well. But in your earlier remarks, Patrick, you spoke about the pandemic, and you know, this world has faced a global pandemic in ways it's never been seen. Businesses are upturned across the globe. Unemployment has shot up through the roof. Economies have tanked. Many workforces have shifted from working entirely from remote sites. Many people have lost jobs. But even all this, amongst all that, in the communities, we are seeing untold sickness. People are dying. But that has not also stopped only around the environment we're in. Even the boardrooms have changed drastically. Gone are the days when you used to go for a board meeting and you do site visits, or the days we had these strategy retreats in posh hotels outside in the national park, or even the board dinners where I would have a lot of conversations to kind of tone down some of the meetings. I could even say that gone is the physical boardroom itself. I've not sat in a boardroom, you know, since March this year. But the good thing is that the work didn't slow down. Most directors have been busier, devoting significantly more time to their duties. Certainly in my case, I can say that we used to meet quarterly, but now I think many of the boards we're meeting monthly. At the height of the crisis, we were meeting almost every week. So if anything, the board's responsibilities have been heightened during the last few months. But the board members have also stepped up and supported management, whether it is in the risk management or it is in you know, supporting the staff who are seated at home, and they've done a good job. Conversely, also, if you ask the board members, many of them are impressed by how the management teams have turned up. I mean, they've worked through these challenges. I was in a board last month, and we were looking at the numbers that are coming through, and we are starting to see a V-shape. The turnover is up, the business is starting to come back. So management has, the management teams they took the crisis, they took the challenges of the crisis. Some of them have come out with innovations, but the truth be told as well, there are winners and losers. Some companies have failed and floated completely, and others, you know, have called in chapter 9, chapter 11, or whatever. And there are a lot of lessons for boards, and I hope people don't lose that momentum. But you, Patrick, as a chair, and someone who works with a wide range of boards, whether in Africa or Europe or in the US, what have been your main takeaways during this?
I think one of my main takeaways is the indomitable human spirit. And whenever we're faced with an external threat, the the way in which some people, not all people, but the way in which some people just rise up and with a big twinkle in their eye, just get on with it and get through it and make the difficult decisions that need to be taken. So I've always said, I think in moments of crisis, your brightest stars twinkle even more brightly. And so what's been wonderful, I think, in the organizations that I chose, to see not just the people who you expected would shine brightly in a crisis, but some new ones emerge. Some quite junior people who've just been sensationally good at doing what they do, working in a team, going above and beyond and doing that. Now, clearly there are other people who haven't stepped up, and, you know, as chairs, we've had to deal with that. I think for most boards, there've been a couple of dimensions of challenge. So one has been, how do we get the balance right between oversight and support? Because in the environment we've been in, you know, since last March, you've needed to provide more oversight. You know, you want to know your people are safe well. You want to know your customers are safe well. You've got to make sure your supply chains are robust and not too fragile. There's a lot of things. You've got to keep your regulator happy through a period when your revenue may have collapsed, and so on. And all the known ratios and relationships between different numbers and metrics have all been tipped up. And getting your head around all that has been quite difficult. At the same time, most management teams have needed more support. So the amount of time that directors have spent has really shot up. But the question you have to always ask yourselves is, you know, are you spending that? If you have a pie chart of your time, you know, it's still limited no matter what goes on with technology to 24/7. You know, how do you want to spend that time, and how do you want to spend that slice of that pie chart that's for that particular company? And I think we've learned through the process side, you know, the speed with which most organizations adopted a virtual way of doing things that they'd, you know, never used virtual to do that before. And decision making in particular has been really interesting. The best boards very early on tried to distinguish between the here and now and the longer term. So, I mean, in terms of the boards I chair, very quickly we decided that there would be a hell of a lot to do for everybody, board and management team. And we would, if you look at that sort of Venn diagram between the board and the management, the intersection, that intersection would grow. But also we would need a nucleus of people who would just get us through the here and now issues that we had to get through. You know, moving everyone to virtual, keeping people safe, all of that sort of thing. And it's very difficult to think about the future and the long term if you're firefighting, if you're in the middle of a crisis. So we decided we'd have one group of board members who would support the team on the here and now, and another group of board members who'd be working on, okay, so if we can get through this, what does that mean for the future? And how might we adjust our strategy and our vision and mobilize our resources in the way that we can come out of this with very clear and good and strong momentum. And then how do we communicate between those two groups so that everybody's got the plot? So we understand and we support what's happening in the here and now. And also we kind of will endorse the things that we're planning for later. And I think organizations that managed to do that, and it was incredibly difficult to do that, have probably done the best, because they were getting ready for coming out and not waiting till we come out to actually then decide what we do. And that had an implication for the way we changed the way we decided strategic decisions. It had definitely had a change in the way we decided on in making investments and the way we budgeted. And it'd be very interesting to chat in a short while about how boards are looking at 2021 and how they're approaching the whole budget and strategy decision-making cycle. But all of that changed, and I think people just had to work very hard. As a consequence, there have been many directors who will be stepping down. because they were overboarded before, so they can't actually spend all this time on all the boards that they're on, or they just think this is not really what they wanted to do. They didn't really sign up for this. So you're seeing their search firms, the major global search firms, are saying there's probably about a quarter of board members are churning at the moment as a consequence of all of this.
I'd like to come back to that. I'd like to come back to that, Patrick, because I think that's an interesting topic in its own. But interesting you say that you divided yourselves in the boardroom. I mean, we also did the same thing. Some board members were there to support management, probably in the day-to-day aspects. The challenge with that has been that, we've moved that emergency level response style to governance. So we've kind of, the components of high quality governance are not fixed. We know that, and the relationship between management and board is not a fixed line. And your board and our boards have been able to expand and adapt as appropriate. The challenge with it, though, is that we've probably overstepped the line. We are doing a lot of what management should be doing, and for me, that's in fact that's a good that Venn diagram is a good one to kind of illustrate the point I'm making. That if you think about it, we've got different relationships between board and management. Sometimes it's parallel, sometimes it's highly effective and doing each other's jobs. But you mentioned a while ago that boards have changed a lot, and I was just wondering whether you could take people through this Venn diagram and how you see its effect.
Yeah.
The effect on boards and the relationship between board and executives, and how you see it going forward in the future.
Yeah, so thanks, Jimmy. So, sadly, some boards are at either end of this spectrum. And I think if we see this sort of chart as a spectrum, so you've got parallel universe boards where, management come along, make a presentation to the board, tolerate a few questions, and really just want to get back and do what they were going to do anyway. And the non-execs feel a bit detached, don't feel as engaged. Alternatively, and this is very common in the venture capital space and in the charity space, you find the non-execs are really trying to do management's job. And one of the challenges through COVID is where if you look in the middle, really good boards that have clarity of role for the board and the exec, the two circles, and they understand what they're doing together in the middle, which are usually the big decisions. The strategy. Our COVID response, for example, would be another example. What happened in the crisis was that intersection grew. Understandably, it grew quite significantly. And the challenge for boards and management teams is to work out a way together as the crisis subsides. How do we, where should that intersection balance be? So where do we want to end up, and how do we actually get there? Lending a lot of support can be done without necessarily doing each other's jobs. And I think the board members who said, look, for the next month, I will lend a hand on, maybe the financing. So you may have the chair of audit and risk helping out the finance director a lot in terms of, how can we meet our regulatory obligations if you're a financial service business, or how can we meet our banking covenants and all the rest of it. All of those things needs hands-on support. But actually, when that's done, then you can ease back. So one of the things that I tried to make sure of in the boards that I chair is that we actually agreed what level of support we would provide, not just kind of do it. And we also agreed that, and actually we're doing this now in December, we would agree to review in December what continuing support there should be for the first quarter of 2021. And already, we've some of the things that people were doing, they've stepped back from. In other cases, they're going to need to continue to provide that support for the next quarter. Talking about it is probably the best way. And I found just getting this chart out with people and saying, you know, we don't want to be over here in the doing each other's jobs. We don't want to be detached. We want to be, you know, engaged, supportive, providing the right oversight, and making the most of people's talents. You know, if you need someone full time, get them. Is our view. Don't sort of get someone else to do it in their spare time.
Yeah, and hopefully you will talk about lessons learned, but there are some lessons learned.
Big time.
And our own experience has been in the times when we've stepped in, for example, to work with management. So for example, on some of the the key risks that we should be managing during the pandemic, management has appreciated the support. The challenge, of course, which we have, and you may have if you haven't experienced it, is when individually you'll have to pull back, and then management knows that now this is their own, they take it on. You don't need to be there all the time.
Yeah, maybe that leads on to this is one of my favorite charts. I've used this for a long time, which is to try and, I think as a board, it can be difficult to really understand the relationship between effectiveness and pressure. So what this basically says is that you're asleep on the left, you know, no pressure, no effort, no output. You're a headless chicken rushing around, you know, but not achieving very much on the right-hand side. And if you're a really good individual or team, you know, you've got the right amount of pressure, which is motivational, stimulating, and you get a hell of a lot done. Now, what's interesting is ordinarily in normal times, really good CEOs tend to be just to the right of the top of that curve. So they're trying to do as much as they possibly can, but they're not over pressured. And really good chairs tend to be to the left. And they've always got time for another board meeting, another conversation with the CEO if they want one. They've really got a bit of capacity to use. Now, what's very interesting is the reaction of a board when they see the CEO or the CFO or both halfway down the right-hand side. So they're under a lot of pressure, and already, you know, there are performance issues. What's our instinctive reaction when we see that? Actually, our instinctive reaction often isn't very helpful. Our instinctive reaction is to put more pressure on. You know, we want more reports, more meetings. Our language shifts. We're sending out signals that we're unhappy with underperformance. And the consequence of that is we put more pressure on them, psychological pressure in this case, or physical pressure if it's more reports and all the rest of it. And they then reach the point where we have to remove the pressure completely because, you know, they're really underperforming significantly. What I saw very positively in the COVID crisis was boards recognized that management were going to come under a lot more pressure, and actually were doing things, helpful things, to try and keep them back towards that middle zone where they were still doing a huge amount, but it was under control. It was sort of dynamic but controlled. I don't know whether that answers the question, Jimmy.
Yeah, it does, and I know it is a long discussion that we can come back to. But I want us to go a little bit back in the boardroom, and probably for you and me as chairs, you know, one of the things that has changed for us working in a virtual interactions is that even the conversations which would ordinarily have been less easier are becoming more difficult. Take an example. If you're having a conversation around board refreshments, and it's a virtual conversation, that's a more challenging conversation than it would have been, partly because of the unique challenges of 2020. And the number of boards I know who do individual performance assessment for each board member, which after the results are out, the chairman sits with the individual director and kind of reads his performance appraisal report. But there are also a lot of boards that are not doing that, and I would encourage if there are any boards that are not doing it, it's probably now is probably the right time for you to think about it. But after those performance discussions, you inevitably get into the conversation of how do we refresh the board? How do we change the composition of the board? You know, who should stay? And you said it in your earlier remarks, some people have stepped up, but there are also some people who are probably overboarded. They're sitting on too many boards that they will not give you the value that you need. So as a chair, the onus is on you to have that tough discussion and tell the individual that I think probably time that you stepped off the board. But I also do remember when we did our first webinar sometime at the beginning of the pandemic, you thought, I remember that comment of yours, you thought that there would be a lot of board churn this year. Do you remember that?
Yeah, it was interesting because I know.
And has your prediction come true? Because I had a different view.
Yeah, so it's definitely come true. So why did I think that? I thought there would be three drivers. So the first would be the needs of the business would change, and if you have a different need, then you might have a different need for different board to suit that purpose. I thought that would be one of the main drivers. So, for example, you know, everyone's wanting to have digital experience, for example. Or, you know, if your plan before was for a big international rollout and now that's not possible, then you don't need that person who you'd recruited for that. So the needs was one driver. The second need was really that people hadn't, there would be some people who I didn't think would be able to step up or didn't want to step up and commit as much time. So that was the second driver. And the third driver was just this, some people just decided actually this was just too much hard work. I don't really fancy doing this anymore. On all of these different boards, I'll reduce my load. And those have been the three drivers. And as I was saying, the major search firms have been telling me that the board churn is about 25%, which is more than would be normal rotation. I think the interesting thing in terms of I've always been of the view that you know, my boards are always in transition. So I'm always thinking, and it's better to have a gradual refreshment than every 6 years have a sudden, you know, big change. So I'm always thinking, you know, what do we need for the next phase? What do we need for the next phase of development? And that should really drive the need for the board. Also this year, we've seen, apart from digital, obviously not so much in Uganda, but in Europe, in Asia, in the US, you've seen, because of Black Lives Matter and other diversity sort of issues, gender, for example, and disability and other things, you've seen many boards actually want to try now to address those issues properly. So you've seen in the US and UK and Europe, you've seen a big demand to add, more women, more people of color, more other sorts of diversity. I mean, it's interesting. I wrote a piece a couple of months ago about, you know, how come there's no disabled people or very few disabled people on the boards of FTSE 350 companies or S&P 500 companies? Isn't that a bit strange when, you know, 15% of the population does have disability in some way, but they don't seem to be represented in boards? How come? And it's interesting, that is getting a bit of traction too. So I think, Jimmy, that there are many people, and of course churn of 25% means 75% are not changing. So there's been a lot of fantastic board members who I think, you know, a lot of people will be asking them to stay longer because of how much they've done. But the stats are board churn is on the rise.
Yeah, that's good. But that's a good segue into the topic of environment, social, and governance, oversight, and the one thing the pandemic has done is to increase focus on culture, on environment, social, and governance, what we normally refer to as the ESG, and on stakeholder management. And for me, for companies, ESG is both a risk and an opportunity. It's about the ways in which value could be destroyed or created if you're not careful. And boards play a critical role in the ESG oversight. Although before the pandemic, there were a lot of gaps, and it sometimes felt like we were in uncharted waters, especially when it comes to the ESG, how to implement ESG, or how to measure ESG, partly because, of course, the benchmarks are different. Not so much in East Africa. Some companies are very good in ESG, but for a lot of boards, they are wondering, how do we get on this bandwagon of ESG? Some people have been wishing, now that the pandemic came, that maybe now the view on ESG would be deferred, and it would be pushed,
Yeah.
into the bushes. But other people are asking, where are you on the sustainability goals? Where are you on your sustainability plans? What were your sustainability plans before the pandemic? What are your sustainability plans going to be after the pandemic?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. I first got into this topic about 20 years ago, and I was sitting with an entrepreneur, and I was trying to get him to do something about health and safety in his factories. This was my sort of goal. And he said, this health and safety, this kind of good governance stuff, this is just for big companies. It doesn't really apply to companies like mine. And I remember saying to him, well, it does if you want to sell it at some point. Because he was always talking about, I'm going to grow this company and I'm going to sell it to General Electric. That was his thing. So I said to him, look, how easy is it to sell a company or get it onto a stock market if it's got these sorts of issues? Really difficult. Now, interestingly, I did a piece of research when I was at 3i, and I looked at, if you take a portfolio of investments, and I took a portfolio of over 100 companies over a 10-year period, and I looked at where is the value created in these companies. And typically, if you buy a company, it's got earnings of X, and you've got a multiple of Y, which you apply to those earnings to get the value crudely, unless it's a technology company. And what I was interested in was, so if you take X times Y today, and then when you sell it, you've got more earnings, hopefully, and you've got a higher multiple. What is the difference? And where is the value created? And what I discovered was that in our portfolio, which was a reasonable cross-sectoral portfolio of industrial and service companies, what you discovered was 60% of the value creation came from growing earnings. 25% came from a bigger multiple on exit. So you were able to sell that company for more times the earnings when you bought it. And clearly, if it's growing, that gives you more. But what was really interesting was, and it's a very simple truism, if you have a company which has a very happy workforce, a very happy customer base, no environmental issues, no tax issues, no other governance issues, a very happy supply chain, it's much easier to sell, and people will pay more for that than they would, which has got issues in each of those areas. So I moved swiftly to argue with entrepreneurs that we were investing in that actually invest in this stuff because you'll make more money if you do, as opposed to invest in this stuff because it's good or the right thing to do, even though it is. So I believed it was the right thing to do. I believed it was the good thing to do, but actually it's also allied to your commercial goals as well. The other pressure these days, which wasn't there 20 years ago, is that investors now are insisting on these things. So if you look at the investors in private equity funds, or a very large, look at BlackRock, you look at large investors in big public companies, they're all insisting that this is what you do. So I think for all those reasons, it's, you may as well join in and make more money as resist it and make less. Is my view.
Yeah, and if anybody didn't understand the S in the ESG, I think now is the time during the pandemic to show that it's important to care about your employees, where they stay, what they do, and what we call the health, safety, and environment. The challenge that tends to be in boards around East Africa is that other than some of the big multinational companies, which are also driven by some of the mother companies, the E, which is the environmental bit, is not so much of a concern for many boards within the East African region, save for the oil companies or the FMCG companies that have a link with their mother companies. The thing though is that their E in this particular case, the board should be talking about sustainability rather than just environment, because sustainability is broader than environment, isn't it?
Yeah, and I see there's a question from Japheth, which is spot on, which is, could you comment on making ESG sustainable and the effort to establish international sustainability reporting standard? I think it's always much easier if you can measure something and you can put a metric on it, and you can measure that over time. Because in the environmental area, for example, it can take some time for the value of investment in reducing emissions or reducing environmental damage to actually take place. And equally, it can take some time for damage to show. So you need measures which work in the long term. This, I think, is also the same for culture, because in my view, a board should know what culture it wants to build in the organization, how it wants to develop the culture in the organization. It should know what culture you've got, and it should have some idea about how you're going to get from what you've got to what you want if they're different. Now, what's interesting is these days there are a lot of tools, Culture Scope and others, which basically take your basic management information that you already have and look for things which will reveal culture, which will describe culture. So, for example, one metric that we've all got that we don't often use as much as we could is the churn in our staff. So how many people are leaving the company? And what's interesting is, if you, a good culture will generally have a loyal and engaged and committed workforce, and churn rates are low. So if you want that, you see that. If you're in an energy business or you're in a financial service business, the level of fines is quite an interesting indicator of your culture. So, are the fines that you are getting, falling, reducing? What is the nature of those fines? Sickness is another thing, which in the chemical industry has been, for a very long time, an indicator of a lot of things. So I think there's a lot of data that we don't use. And one of the things I think that's been really interesting coming out of COVID is, I think the weighting on evidence and the weighting on statistics has been higher. The awareness of statistics in the last year has been higher than it's probably ever been. Yet it's quite interesting when you ask the question, how many board members actually are proficient at knowing their way around the basics of statistics, the statistics that are presented to them, and so on. There's an exceptional book come out this year called The Art of Statistics by a guy called David Spiegelhalter, which is a really good guide if you're not a mathematician or statistician into the basics of statistics and how they're presented and what traps you can fall into and so on. It's a really interesting topic. And there's another one called Dark Data by a guy called David Hand, which is all about the data we've got that we don't use. which I think is a really fantastic idea, because we have all this data sitting in our companies, but you know, we often don't use it as well as we might.
Yeah, yeah, and partly and why ESG is looking difficult in some of our boardrooms is that the benchmarks that are coming out, even though I did read, I think after the Davos meeting, is that they were trying to harmonize the benchmarks as far as ESG is concerned. So I think for the board chairs who are on the call, there is a session for your board members to kind of just educate them a little bit more around the practices and principles of ESG, because as you rightly said, some of that data is there. Some of the data we've been receiving around staff during the pandemic, how many people are ill, how many people are working where, you know, the HSC data, how many, you know, is available, but how we harness it, how we read it is an important thing. But maybe to relate to our earlier, to that favorite triangle of mine, the people processes, where would you see ESG sit in the board committee? Who would have ownership of the ESG elements in the board committee for you?
So I think it's like everybody has a role to play in it. So, but in terms of, and it depends on the nature of the company. So what some boards have been doing is setting up a stakeholder committee, which is quite an interesting idea. And what they've been doing is saying, look, in our business, there's probably 5 key stakeholders or 6 key stakeholders. And have we got a clear strategy for our approach with those stakeholders? So one might be communities. So if we are an industrial company, we have factories. Communities in the places where we have factories might be a key stakeholder. Shareholders would be another one, staff would be another one, suppliers would be another one, the regulator might be another one. And one of the first things to do, so if you take environmental regulation, as a company, we could decide to do the bare minimum. So, you know, we just do what the regulator wants. So we keep our operating license, our license to operate. Or we could actually, because we want to, or because we see commercial value in it, go beyond that. So, you know, if you look at a company like Patagonia, a clothing company, it's gone way beyond what any regulator would ask them to do, but it actually generates additional customers because of that. So they're seeing, actually, this is what we want to do, but also it's generating significant margin. We might decide, you know, do we want to be in the top 10% in the industry in the regulator's eyes in terms of how good we are on that. That might help you attract the best people. It might help you do lots of other things. One of the challenges is in growth markets, and this is one of the things I saw in China 20 years ago, was that if you're in a big growth market, and many African markets are like this for some products, then actually there's not as much pressure to do those things because the competitive pressure isn't as high because the market is growing so quickly. But the moment growth slows to you know, more traditional levels, if you like, in terms of just being then linked more to basic demographics, you know, the more competitive it will be. So it's a question of when you want to do this as well as what you want to do. Most, I mean, it's interesting in the chemicals, energy, process industries, there are likely to be environmental committees. In professional service businesses, there probably won't be.
Yeah. Interesting you say that. Before I move on to the other topic, is you know, whereas we may not have the competitive pressure around some of the ESG measurements or parameters, because we also are producing for export markets. So the buyers, people like Sainsbury or Marks and Spencer, would be asking for some statistics. So
Yeah.
it is just important that the boardroom is aware of the environment and the customers and the stakeholders they're dealing with, because ESG may not matter in the local market here if I go to the market, but if I put an onion on Sainsbury and then the statistics indicate that I'm using underage, you know, that has an implication. But let's move on to a bit about board dynamics, which is another favorite.
Yeah, one of my favorite topics.
And I know you also love dealing with conflicts quite a bit in boardrooms. I mean, what we see is, before we bring on board members, first of all, they're very highly educated. They're very accomplished individuals in their executive roles, and they are successful individuals. Yet they come into that boardroom, and you've probably also witnessed it. You find discussions that derail them. You find their opinions are dismissed. You find directors who dominate. And some of these could be traced to common biases. For example, it could be the authority bias, because that particular director who is a bully represents the majority shareholder. Or it could be a groupthink, that the board is overly concerned in ensuring there's consensus around the table. Let us all agree. We kind of shouldn't be seen to argue too much. But it could also be just a reluctance to change. And that's why, you know, your earlier conversation of board churn becomes an important one. But I know over the years you've dealt with some of these conflicts and in boardrooms and decision making.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of my favorites.
Where's the big deal?
The big deal? Well, this is a big question, Jimmy, and as you know, I can spend a whole day on this, but I won't. So my starting point is around self-awareness, because I think this is so critical, because in order to resolve a conflict, usually you have to have a very good understanding of the other person or group of people and you or your group of people. And a couple of years ago, there was a great piece of research came out of Harvard Business School, which it studied people in terms of how self-aware they were. And what it did was and how that would impact on performance. It did a series of robust tests to test how self-aware you were, and it put people into groups. People who were very self-aware, people who were not very self-aware at all. And it gave them some tasks to do. And interestingly, the people who were in the very self-aware groups were twice as effective at making decisions, at coordinating amongst themselves, and at resolving and managing conflict. So actually some level of self-awareness is helpful. The second thing is people who can differentiate between facts and interpretations also tend to be better at managing conflicts. So, you know, actually that person makes me feel this way, but actually what is he saying? What does he want? What are their objectives? So some people just are very irritating and wind you up. They might actually be asking you to do something very sensible, but they're just irritating. So you rebel against that. Other people might be very charming and delightful and actually maybe asking you to do something really stupid, but you might do it because you like them. So judgment is really critical in resolving conflict. And you know, when interviewing directors, I'm always on the lookout for, you know, how good is this person's judgment of people, of commercial situations, of the relevant things for you? How good are their interpersonal skills? And then when you look at it, there's a famous test. It's called a Thomas Kilmann test, and you can do it online, and it will actually reveal to you what are your most instinctive responses to a conflict. Okay, so how do you normally react when you're in a conflict situation? And it basically says there's 5 main ways you can respond in a conflict. You can compete, you can collaborate, you can compromise, you can avoid, or you can accommodate. And what's interesting, having tested CEOs over many years, I've realized that CEOs tend to be very high in 2 of those 5 things. They tend to be very high in compete and avoid. So they'll die in a ditch over something they really care about. They'll be, they'll really be tenacious about that. Or if it's something they don't consider to be very important, they'll just let go of it quite quickly. Sophisticated CEOs might throw a veil of collaboration over a meeting. So they may start a meeting by saying, "Good morning, everyone. I'm really interested to know what you think." But the moment the team looks like they might come up with the wrong answer, they suddenly become competitive. Or if it's something of low stakes, they kind of back off. Now, what's interesting is when you look at really good chairs, so I've also tested really good chairs to see what their profile is. And what's interesting is they are not strong in any two. They're even across all five because they know when to avoid. And avoid sounds like a negative thing, doesn't it? But it's not. You might decide, actually, I'm not going to deal with that now in the board meeting. I'm going to deal with that later. Or they might decide, actually, that's a values thing. That's a cultural thing, a very important thing. I'll compete over this now in the board meeting. I'm not having this. This is something I'm going to stand firm on. But they know when to collaborate, when to compromise, when to avoid, accommodate, and so on. So it's really quite interesting. And the good conflict managers always tend to have an idea what outcome they want.
Yeah.
And then they work back from that.
And that is probably also very relevant for the board chairs. And maybe if the lead people give us another opportunity, we could have a conversation around board chairs and how to become a good board chair, because those are some of the key characteristics. But of course, given my career as my new career as an executive coach, I can't help but talk about the Myers-Briggs test.
Yeah.
So the Myers-Briggs test is probably something that would be good to do in a boardroom, so that you can see which inkling people have, whether it's intuition or extroverts or introverts, and there are a couple of tools which could be used in kind of just bringing out some of the board dynamics.
Yeah, and these things all help with self-awareness. One other thing I forgot to say, which I should have said actually, is that there was a very big study done a few years ago to see, on average, how self-aware are people in large organizations. So these two guys, I think they were called Ethan Zell and Zlatan Kurzan, and they combined a series of studies that had already been done to get a sample of 375,000 people. So this is a very big sample. And what they discovered was when they measured in these various tests, what people's own description of their strengths and their weaknesses and what they were good at with objective facts and other people's views, they found the correlation was only 0.29. And of course, for the non-statisticians amongst you, to have a perfectly good idea of your strengths or weaknesses, meeting with objective fact, that correlation would have to be 1. So what they proved was, not only are we not very good, we're really not very good at all at being self-aware. So we need quite a lot of help on this topic. So anything, having a coach, having a good boss who's a really good mentor and a critical friend is really helpful to assess that. My favorite was they found a CEO who said he was a real people person, and actually they discovered that the churn in his business was 50%.
But I mean, that probably brings us to culture, and I know we could go on to that topic, and I know that the UK corporate governance, for example, encourages or requires that there's a senior independent director who is able, for example, to advise the chair. But probably that's a discussion we could have another day. But in this day of social media, I can't help but comment about some of the reputational issues. So for directors, for many of us directors, board service can go well beyond just fulfilling a professional duty. We feel a strong connection to the company that we sit on the board for, and we tend to also associate our own personal brands with that of the company. So the company's governance decisions, the major events that take place in the company are a reflection of ourselves. And For example, in some of the cases where, you know, more in Europe, not so much here, but in cases where there've been, you know, disclosing material weaknesses, there's been cyber breaches, or some of the, you know, the Black Lives Matter example, or the Me Too campaigns that have gone on, and yet you sit on that board and you associate your own reputation with that of the company they serve. And it's clear there's a very strong connection. We didn't have the Me Too campaign in East Africa, but we see them on CNN, and we also have our own kind of issues. But just thinking about all the things we've spoken about around virtual working, around gender diversity, around employees able to work remotely, around bullies in the boardroom, what aspects of the board and company culture must evolve to support some of the virtual settings? And maybe the other one to think about, because there's a bit of diversity that we're speaking about, what is getting in the way of board diversity? And I'm not only just talking about gender diversity.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. I mean, a lot of this is about human behavior, and a lot of it is rooted in trust and openness and transparency. So it's really interesting. I mean, one of the organizations I chair is the EY Foundation in the UK, and we help disadvantaged kids get into quality work. And as it turns out, because we're working in areas of very high poverty, it's turned out that 80% of our cohorts of the young people that we help are from Black and ethnic minorities. And we decided from the very beginning that we would have a diverse board, and we have a diverse board, but it wasn't diverse enough to reflect, you know, the bulk of the people that we're working with. So we made some commitments, and we you know, we're well on our way to achieving those. The reason I mention that is that, one, we thought we were doing a good job, but we weren't as much as we should have. And it was only by looking at the data, looking at who we are, listening to people, and then making a commitment and then meeting that commitment. It's interesting, you know, one of the things we're looking at in ESSA at the moment, which is an astonishing thing in Africa, across Africa, only 2.5% of the vice chancellors at African universities are women. In Ghana, there are only 8 women professors. This seems to me to be missing an enormous opportunity, and also not be right. So at the moment, we're working on a series of activities to a bit like the 30% Club did in the corporate world, to change that. And I think we will make progress on that over the next 10 years, but that'll be a slow thing, and it requires quite a lot of different components to make that happen. I think the internet, social media, Glassdoor, all of these things are providing pressures to promote for change. But there's a long way to go on a lot of these things. When I was on the Higgs review in the UK Corporate Governance Review, at that point only 6% of all FTSE 250 directors were women. Yeah, that number is now 33%. It should be 50. So there's quite a long way to go. Sadly, a lot of these things don't happen as quickly as you would like.
Yeah, I mean, that last bit is an interesting one, coming from boards with all sorts of conflict. And then here you are talking about parity and talking about mathematics and talking about diversity. I mean, and you've spent quite some years. I think at the time you said it was about 15 or 20 years. But could you tell us a little bit more about why, as a person who comes from Liverpool, you've made it such a big part of your life? Are you trying to get to connect to a higher purpose in your life, which you can't get as fulfillment in directorships?
I don't think I'm that clever, Jimmy. So I came from an Irish immigrant family in Liverpool, and grew up there in the 60s and 70s, and it was a very difficult place, but we had a large African community in Liverpool. So, you know, as a kid, unlike many other places in the UK at the time, you know, I had a lot of interaction with people from Africa, because it was a big port, and some of the history of Liverpool is just terrible, you know, terrible history. But interestingly, Liverpool made a big thing of its terrible history to try and educate people that, you know, this was wrong what happened in the past, in you know, with the slave trade and so on. My mother also, we came from a very poor background, but my mother always said that, you know, we were incredibly rich, we were incredibly lucky to be in our family, and there were people in the world who were far you know, far less advantaged than we were, and at that time on the radio, I used to like the radio a lot. I heard some speeches from Nelson Mandela, which had an incredible impact on me as a small boy. And then when I was also, you know, I disagreed with apartheid in South Africa, and I was sort of, you know, in a very, you know, pathetic way, really, sort of protesting against that. And then when I started to make a little bit of money and do okay, I started to get involved and be really interested in African education, because to me, education liberated me. You know, going to Warwick, doing maths, changed my life completely, and it changed my family's life. And I could see the power of education. And so I thought, actually, if you want to do something to help with a small amount of resource, then, you know, you could change things around education. And so Warwick in Africa was my first decent sized thing. It was only a £30,000 startup, but as you said in the beginning, you know, 750,000 children have now benefited from that in Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa, and Kenya. And then in growing that, I realized there were a lot of problems, systemic problems, shortages of faculty, scholarships are a bit of a mess. Lots of things. You couldn't find African research on education very easily. So I founded ESSA to try and you know, work on some of these issues. It's got a majority African board. It's got 3 incredible women on the board as well, who are all business leaders. And we've done some really cool stuff in just 4.5 years. You know, we've created the first database of African research on education. It's free. It's giving greater visibility for African researchers. We've come up with a proper KPI framework for scholarships to increase the effectiveness, the ROI on scholarships. We've proven what the shortages of faculty are. We're working on this women leaders issue, and today we're launching the first Pan-African academic jobs board, so that there's greater transparency around academic jobs, and we can encourage some diaspora to come back to Africa and take some of the jobs, because it's the biggest growth market for tertiary education in the world. So loads of jobs. I could go on forever, Jimmy. I know, but I should probably pause there.
I always get fascinated with the way, the passion the emotional side that you show when you're telling that story, and we can only wish you luck. But we'll come back to that, and I'm conscious of time, and we have a few questions out there. But maybe before we go to the questions, let me show the people. This is the book that Patrick has been speaking about. This is his book. It's called Boards. It's a very easy read, by the way, and it's also just won the 2020 management business book. You know, and so if you have it, you probably have one of the books. It is along the lines of people, purpose, and processes, and there are a lot of dilemmas which I would encourage you to read. I think there is the chair, Trudy, has something to say about it at the end, so I won't steal her thunder. But I just thought, as I was seeing all the questions coming up, what does the book like, and you know, where to find that. Thank you very much, Patrick, for this first part. Let's now go into the Q&A, and I would invite Elizabeth to, if we have some questions, we can respond to those questions. Elizabeth, could you share with us?
All right. Thank you, Jimmy and Patrick, for such an insightful conversation. Yeah, I have shared the questions to you directly. If you just look through onto the panel and then choose which ones you want to answer.
Yeah.
We'll just give you a few minutes. We won't be able to answer all of them. Just choose a few. I know you answered Japheth Kato's question, and then we have a few there.
Yeah.
So if you could just
so there's
look
one
through.
Yeah, so there's one that I really would like to answer, which is about having more young people on boards, which I am a huge fan of that. So on most of the boards that I chair, we have young people, and they add a huge amount of difference. One of the things that's happening in many large organizations now is the creation of what are called next-gen boards. So Gucci, the FT, Interbrand are probably the best known of these. But this is where you have a group of younger people from the organization and perhaps from your orbit, so maybe customers or suppliers, whatever, and they get the board papers and they have a connection with the board. They're not on the main board. Maybe the chair of this next-gen board sits on the board, but they all, Gucci, for example, is probably the best known. Years ago, it felt its board needed to be younger, but it didn't want to have a lot of young people on the board, so it created this next-gen board. And today it claims that that next-gen board has been responsible for pushing Gucci into getting a digital strategy earlier than its main competitors and having a better digital strategy. And Gucci has way outperformed Prada, for example, and over the last 5 years, and they put a large part of that down to having that next gen board. The FT is looking at this because it realizes that, you know, it needs to be relevant to its future readers as well as its current readers. So it's really quite interesting.
Yeah. There is one which has been asked by Annette, which I can answer. What ways should boards and board members be assessed whether they have delivered, and how often should this be done? I mean, it again starts on the view you take around board members. Board members are almost like executives. They come up, they have objectives at the beginning of the year that they need to deliver. There's a strategy that the board needs to deliver, and they should be evaluated against those objectives and strategies that, you know, that were agreed upon at the beginning of the year. And the way the assessments are done, it's in some boards there could be internal assessments where you almost do like a 360-degree feedback, and you give each other feedback, probably made whether anonymously or openly. You could do that. In other ways, there are corporate governance consultants who are out there who can give you a very nice questionnaire, help you do a board evaluation so that all the answers are sent to the contractor or the consultant, who then summarizes. And the way it is done, he summarizes for the individual without naming the so-and-so director. Patrick said so much about Jimmy, but he kind of summarizes the general themes, which he gives to the chair, who then gets a chance to sit with the individual directors and goes through their report. For the chair, you could choose, it could be the chairman of REMCO, or it could be the nominations, the governance chair, or it could be the senior independent director if you have one. But the important thing is that the objective is very much to ensure, how do we improve as board members? What do we need to do? And And it's a process that initially it is difficult. And again, it depends a little bit about the board dynamics. You've got to be comfortable with each other so that you are able to give each other, real feedback rather than wishy-washy feedback.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the best board reviews I ever had done on a board I was on, I got done by the youngest person on the board who just joined the board. They were fresh, they weren't so experienced, but for some reason, people opened up and told that person things that perhaps they weren't saying before, and they learned a lot, and they were it was very straightforward, and there were a lot of things that we were doing that we could do a lot better, and it was that young person who didn't have the kind of, I think with other people, maybe they were less open. One of the most important things to find in a board review is how aligned people are. That's one of the big things for me. Are we really aligned? And I have one final image I wanted to show, which I thought might help with this, which is, this. Sorry, I'm not very good with it. So, are you kind of all pointed in the same direction, but have enough degrees of difference, the triangle in the middle, that it's really healthy? Are you a rabble on the left, you're all pointing in different directions? Or are you a monarchist state? I think really understanding how aligned you are is a critical part of a board review. It never is going to appear in a public statement of a board review, but from a real use, real value, that's one of the most important things.
Yeah. Patrick, there was a question from a gentleman from Nigeria who was asking, what do you see as the priorities for the 2021 boards? What would be the priorities be?
Yeah, so the first thing I think is to spend some time thinking about what are the biggest decisions you are going to have to make in your organization in the coming year. When should you make those decisions? How should you make those decisions? What information should you have? And then really think about that in terms of planning your year for 2021. Now, some things will come along we can't predict, but you probably know 2 or 3 big decisions that you're going to have to take. The second thing is really around how you're doing strategy and budgeting. So a lot of organizations have moved from a formal 5 or 3 year strategy to producing a strategic framework. So these are the parameters by which we'll make decisions in the coming year. So this is our broad strategy. These are the big things. And they're approaching their budgeting not in a calendar type way, but in a more dynamic way. So we will make these investments assuming we have this level of financial resource and our earnings or our income is this level. And it's sort of like the difference between a map and a sat nav, I think. So a traditional budget is like a map. We draw the map out. We know what route we'll go from A to B, no matter what information becomes available later. That's the way we're going to go. Whereas a sat nav, you're working on the latest information. And management teams need certainty to spend, to recruit, to so on. So by having this sort of dynamic framework, so you know that if these conditions apply, yeah, go ahead and recruit those people. But actually, if the income is still much lower, so it's not doing what Jimmy was saying earlier, it's not doing a V, it's on a much slower gradient of recovery, then maybe you need to pace yourself a little bit more slowly. So I think the priority, I think, is it may sound silly, but it's trying to decide how you're going to decide in the coming year. That's a number 1 priority. The second thing is, for your business, your best people will be vulnerable to being poached by other people, because they won't only have shone in front of you, they'll have shone in front of other people. So make absolutely sure you've got your key people, in the exec team and below, and ask the management teams, what's our retention strategy for those key people. It's very easy when you have a overall job market environment like we have at the moment to get lazy on people and think, you know, well, everyone wants a job, they're lucky to work here. All of those things that, you know, you can hear people say. Actually, you know, if you've managed to find a fantastic digital team, then you need to keep hold of them because everyone will want them. And it'll be evident that they're doing a good job, for example. I think the other area that's changing is what is the employer model that we have for our organization. So COVID has tipped things up a bit, you know, with people where you can working from home and some not, people on contract, people who are employees, and so on. And I think it's worth a reflection on what now should be our employer model going forward. And on risk management, I've seen a big change from a what I would describe as a just-in-time mentality. So we're happy to operate with relatively high levels of risk to maximize margin, to what I call a just-in-case mentality. So actually, we will build our reserves back. We will build our resources. We'll build in more contingency because, you know, 2020 has shown us there will be a point when you need it. And a lot of organizations have reduced their reserves, not just financial, but human, and in other ways. And we probably need to be building back a bit because who knows what the next thing will be. I mean, this is a massive hit this year, but, you know, who's to say there isn't something bigger coming? And climate change, I think, particularly in many African countries, you know, is baked in and will happen. And, you know, are you really prepared for that in terms of flooding, natural disaster, all of those things? And you know, look at the year East Africa's had, you know, with the locusts and other things, the flooding, and so on. So have you got enough reserves?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I would probably just add, I think where boards need to sit is to take a look back, look in the mirror and say, what has happened in 2020 and what have we learned? What are the good things we'd like to keep? And what are those things we are going to drop because of what we know? So I'll put that. The other discussion which we had here is around this environment, social and governance. I think we should move it from just being talk, but to really start executing on it. And I think people are going to be asking people are going to be asking the boards, what are you really doing about the ESG space? Because there is a feeling out there in the communities that companies need to be good corporate citizens, and you cannot continue just talking about it or putting taglines or running very glossy adverts. The other one for me from the board is the discussion we've just had on board composition. As a board, you need to, again, look through after your evaluation, look through and say, do we have the right boards? Do we have the right committees? Are we able to reshuffle the committees to ensure that we get the, you know, the best that we can do? And then there's one on the company purpose. I think we spoke about it at the beginning. Quite a lot of people, I mean, a lot of people seem to understand why they're there in the board, but quite a lot of boards don't understand why are they board members. And there was a question which is linked to that with government around, you know, the role of government directors versus, you know, the executives. You know, decisions are done in government already, and then they're brought into the board for ratification. So you need to sit down as a board in that board and ask yourself, why are we here? Are we here to rubber stamp, or are we here really to provide governance as we need to do? And then the final one, which is always spoken about, and you know, just to add on what Patrick has said, is the board information. There's so much information out there, whether it is digitalization. The challenge with when we talk about you know, getting digital is such a big space. I mean, you've got information security, you've got you know, different facets of digitization. And what is our strategy as a board as far as digitization is concerned? Because AI has come to stay. We know what Amazon has done over the last few years.
Yeah. What's interesting is actually there's now a bit of a wave, and obviously the consultants will be very active on this. But do you know as a company what data you've actually got? Does the board actually know what data you've really got? I mean, IBM would say that most organizations only use 10% of the data that they've got. And what's happened with technological change has been that now we're much more able to access the data that we've got, combine data that we've got, see things in the data that were not easy to see before because of, big data computing power and so on. And it's fascinating when you look at some of this stuff there's one organization I was working with, we just looked at, we spent a morning just looking at what data do we actually collect, and what could we do with that data that we're not doing now? What could that help us? How could that inform us make better decisions? I mean, the other thing that is interesting, which going back to your point, Jimmy, around what have we learned? I think I'm looking forward to doing this in January with all of the boards I'm on. We're going to look at the decisions we took in 2020, and we're going to look at how good they were or not good they were, and what can we learn from that? Because the way we make decisions, we don't need to employ the same method of decision making for every type of decision. And some decisions we probably weren't making in the most effective way. One trend that's come up that's really a growing trend is the approach of early, mid, late decision making. So instead of trying to tackle a big decision in one go with one board paper on one afternoon or morning, you actually break it down into three. You say, let's discuss this, a first meeting, let's explore all the issues. Let's then work out what choices we've got. Management then go away, work on those choices, come back with a recommendation on a couple of choices. We then hammer around that, and then a final decision, which is based just as much on understanding how it's going to be implemented as the decision itself. Because most decisions, when you look back, you discover that actually the decision was right, we just didn't do the implementation very well. And so boards getting more thoughtful about how things are going to be implemented, I think, is a trend that's going to happen in the coming year.
It seems there are more questions. We are going to run out of time because I know.
True.
But I just wanted to say, maybe before we go off with Patrick, my parting words that, first of all, I think we all need to realize that there is no going backwards. The pandemic has come and boards are going to be transformed. Governance is not going to be the same, neither can the stakeholder relationships continue being the same. So coming out of this crisis, what we need to think about is how do we become better boards and better directors? And what have we learned is really the question you need to take to your board on Monday and ask everybody, what have we learned? How do we become better as board members and as individuals? Thank you for listening to us. I don't know, Patrick, whether you have any parting shot before we hand over to Elizabeth?
My only thing to say is I think I've been really excited by the quality and number of questions, and I think I am one of you, so I understand this, but I think it's been an incredibly challenging year, and I think you should feel a sense of satisfaction for getting through it. And I think, I wish you every success for 2021, and I really hope that the next meeting I'm able to join, I'll be joining in person, because so many things have been solved by then. But I would love to do that, and I have 3 trips to Nairobi already that are due, so I'll be back as soon as I'm vaccinated and it's safe.
Thank you so much, Patrick and Jimmy, for such an insightful conversation. Allow me to invite our chairperson of LEAD, Mrs. Gertrude Karugaba, to move a vote of thanks to the panelists, the attendees, and maybe speak about Patrick's book and what LEAD is planning to do with regards to that and the way forward for LEAD. Thank you, Gertrude.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good evening. Thank you to Jimmy and Patrick for a superb execution of this topic. We're always been challenged in this year. What are the characteristics of high-performing boards? Where we were at the beginning of the year is certainly very different from where we find ourselves. Through it all, you know, boards have worked hard to try and be relevant, to emphasize purpose, to look at people, to look at process, in order that the organizations can remain afloat. So I just want to thank Jimmy and Patrick so much. We don't take your time for granted. For the members, we have not paid Jimmy or Patrick anything to be part of the conversation today. So we just want to thank you very much. For Patrick, I think this is the start of a very good relationship. A couple of years ago, I was at Cranfield University for a governance related subject. So I know what Cranfield is able to do. And I know that this is the beginning of a very productive and positive relationship, not just with you as a person, but with the institutions that you represent. Jimmy, thank you very much. I think the local perspective is always critical. Sometimes we look at research and we wonder whether it's relevant, and sometimes people are questioning, are we talking about Uganda? Are we talking about Africa? Are we talking about the world? But thank you very much for that local perspective. And I just want to thank our lead members as well. You've been so responsive this year, even if we haven't been able to meet in person since March. You have been responsive whenever we've asked you to come and be part of this conversation. And I believe that we have learned a lot over the year. Certainly, I've learned a lot. I am a board trainer. I sit on boards, but every time I listen to people like Jimmy and Patrick, I go away, you know, fully enriched and with new perspective, especially Patrick, around that. Some of those circles around board management dynamics are really, really critical. For our members as well, and even the corporate partners we have, a lot of snippets have been shared by Jimmy and Patrick. Some things we need to think about. We've talked about board evaluation. We've talked about board churn and, you know, reviewing board composition. We have talked about, Patrick talked about the next generation board. And I want to encourage our corporate partners. Part of the reason LEAD exists is to be able to support not just individual directors, but boards along those areas. So we're available, the team is available at LEAD. Call us in, talk to us, ask us to support you, and we'll be glad to do that. Finally, for our members, even though it's been a challenging year, we have a gift for you, Patrick's book. I think Jimmy has already talked about the records it is breaking already. So we will arrange for all of our members to receive a copy of that book. Of course, there are some logistical issues around shipment, characteristic of the COVID season, but I hope that each one of you will at least be able to get your copy of the book as soon as possible. I want to thank Elizabeth for the moderation. I will call it moderation because she's taken us through the Q&A. She's introduced the panelists. She stayed through it all and supported us in this process. So thank you, Elizabeth. I want to thank the team at LEAD, Ivan and team, ably supporting us through the year, logistically, with information, and just to encourage each one of us to keep looking at ways that we can be more effective. Even if you're not yet on a board and you're aspiring to join one, all of these insights and experiences are going to be critical for you so you hit the ground running. I just want to stop here by wishing everyone happy holidays. Hopefully, Patrick, you said maybe next year things will be better. Maybe we'll be able to see each other in person. I certainly hope that we will. But until we meet again in person, I wish you all the best for the holidays. Stay safe Protect yourself, protect your families, and yes, have a good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Elizabeth.